Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the Politics and Media Show. In the second part of today's show, we're discussing a new survey by the Guardian newspaper, which has revealed that less than half of the UK's population identify as British. A large majority of Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish residents don't describe themselves as British when asked what they would call themselves. The survey's findings support the findings of recent, more in-depth studies on voters' attitudes to their national identities. The British and Scottish social attitude surveys and parallel studies in Wales and Northern Ireland have shown wide differences in perceptions of national identity across the UK. Well, with me in the studio to discuss this is the writer and broadcaster Dreda Say Mitchell. Welcome to the show. And we also have with us still Matthew Tariq Wilkinson from the Muslim Council of Britain. Thank you for staying with us. If I can just come to you first, what do you make of this survey? You wrote an interesting piece in The Guardian not long ago where you're saying that perhaps black British residents would be the last people standing up for Britain. What was that based on?
It's been very interesting because my perception of kind of black identity, and using the term black, it's such a big, broad term. So my kind of focal point is people of Caribbean heritage. And really, when I think about my own identity, it has really shifted from when I was young to thinking much more as being black, much more to thinking of myself as British now, really. And I think that's what's very much happened in the Caribbean communities. A lot more people feel themselves as being British. I don't think they would necessarily call themselves English, really, but I think there has been a lot more signing up to being British. If I think about my nephews, you know, I remember talking to my nephew recently and I said to him, do you feel British? And he said to me, what a silly question, of course I feel British. I am British, you know.
So for him it was a no-brainer, and yet for someone like yourself, you said you've been through this journey. Can you describe why at one point you wouldn't have used the term British? I mean, perhaps to put some context.
What happens very much with the migration story is the first people who come, so with my family, it'd be the Caribbean community. My parents were very clear they were not British. They might have come what they call to the mother country, but they were definitely from the island of Grenada. Whereas I think that second generation, my generation, it's always that generation that has a bit more of a kind of a complex relationship with the country that they live in, and very much.
So you were born here, and your parents had come from abroad. So this is.
Yes, so they came here in the 60s. I was born here in the mid 60s. And then you got a sense of the country you were living in, maybe hadn't, you know, signed up to you.
Yeah.
So very much sometimes relationships with the police, the education system, housing, all those public institutions that should be there to help communities. It didn't feel sometimes for us that it was there to help us. So it's almost like something from outside then defines who your identity is, rather than everyone thinks they identify, they kind of have their own identity.
Being black at one point was a way of asserting.
It wasn't even just being black though, it was being black and from the Caribbean. So we use
specific.
Very specific, and I think that's it sometimes. We use these big, broad terms, but when you talk to people on an individual basis, it's a lot more complex and a lot more deep than that.
Well, as second generation British Pakistani, I can relate very much to what Dreda has just said. And yourself, you could kind of almost say it's a backward, the opposite of what you've described. You're Matthew Wilkinson, now known as Dr. Matthew Tariq Wilkinson. How would you describe your journey? Would you see yourself as going from white mainstream English to a more ethnic identity by virtue of the fact that you're associated with a different faith now?
Not really, no. I mean, it's an interesting question, and in some ways faith and culture are very closely connected. But I don't see my move into Islam in any way as becoming Pakistani or Bangladeshi or...
Not in yourself personally, but in terms of how you're aware how other people might perceive you.
I mean, yes, certainly in terms of the perception of others, definitely.
So if we come onto that first, what for you shifted, do you think, in terms of how you felt other people view you?
Well, unfortunately, you know, Islam is still, although less and less, but still viewed very much as an other religion, a religion for foreigners. And actually, nowadays, religion almost per se is another thing, but that's a slightly different question. So, you know, you are, in a sense, becoming part of a group that seems strange and unfamiliar. So that casts you a little bit as an outsider. But from within me, I don't feel that I'm any less British than I was when I was not a Muslim. I feel actually, you know, my Muslimness has given the chance for my Britishness to become a little bit better.
In what way? How would you describe that?
the qualities that Islam tries to promote, modesty and thrift and care for other people and social responsibility, you know, the good values of Islam, are things that I think when Britain has been strong and united have been the things that have united us, not, it's been the values that have brought us together and a shared project, not, you know, whether we're white or whatever we might be. And that, I think, is very important, that a national identity should be built upon achieving great things together, wherever we're all from originally. Because, I mean, you know, originally my relations were from, you know, who knows, well, I do know where, Scotland and Holland and all over the place.
So what would you have described yourself? Would you describe yourself as English, British, in terms of your ethnicity?
Well, I think if I may slightly complicate the issue, I think that's a rather unfair question, because Englishness and Britishness are two very different things. Britishness refers to a national identity built upon a state identity, because Britain is a composite thing of, you know, England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So it's a national state identity, but Englishness or Irishness or Scottishness or Welshness or Caribbeanness, that's an ethnic identity. And so when people are forced to make the choice, are you British or English? Are you Afro-Caribbean or British? Are you Pakistani or British? Actually, they're being made to make an unfair, unreal choice.
For those people who see themselves as both, but clearly there are some people who do see it as either one or the other.
I see myself, you see. I think I got to the stage in my life where I realised, hang on a minute, I don't have to keep making these choices. I'm a very greedy woman, I can have it all. And that's what I would describe myself. So I don't talk about people having an identity. We all come with identities. We don't all come from a community. We come from communities. So I see myself as Caribbean heritage, Grenadian heritage, an East Ender, a Londoner, a woman, a writer, a broadcaster. And I think
it's ridiculous to ask you, are you a woman or are you black, say? You know, clearly it can be
but very often, I'll give you an example of this. I used to get asked quite a lot in terms of my writing. People used to describe me as a black writer, and I used to stop people and say, no, I'm not a black writer, but because putting the black before writer, that's where the emphasis is. And I would say to people, no, I'm a writer who happens to be black. I'm also a writer who happens to be a woman. And I think that's what we need to work with the generations coming up, is this sense that people don't have to just fit inside a box. You can choose which boxes you want to be in. And as the years goes on, those boxes that you choose will shift depending on your internal experiences, but also the experiences that you're having with the outside world.
But it's interesting, you said, because some of that does come from a sense of confidence and belonging in the first place. It's interesting that those people who feel that the institutions and wider society has accepted them then feel more able to say, yes, I am British. And perhaps that's why it explains how perhaps some of us who are now the older generation are more comfortable with labelling ourselves as both of these things and claiming more aspects.
Maybe, you know, I got stopped by the police last year outside the BBC of all places, you know, down in White City. And I got checked because they thought I might be a gangster's girlfriend and might be carrying a knife, you know. But that has not stopped me saying I am British. That just hasn't stopped me. And I think I just reached a point in my life. And I think some of the younger people in my family, when I talk to them, have reached a point in their lives where they said, no, I'm deciding who I am, regardless of the relationship or part of the relationship that some institutions might have with me part of the time. I'm going to be the person at the centre, rather than what happens is if institutions or your experiences with outside world define who you are, you inevitably end up with your back against the wall. And that's the difference. Are you someone with your back against the wall, or are you in the centre taking control of your life? And I think it's that narrative we have to talk to our young people about. Yeah.
Choice. If I could just press on that point a little more, because I made that link because when I read this Guardian report, I found it interesting that where devolution has taken place, with the Welsh Assembly coming in and we've got more Scottish nationalism, that actually more of those people are now saying that they would identify themselves as British. And I'm assuming it's not because they've lost pride in their own ethnic identity. Perhaps it's they feel a bit more warm towards a Britain where they don't have to suppress their own identity anymore. I was just wondering whether there is possibly a link with that. So you get the kind of an ironic...
I think so, and I actually think as well what's happened in Europe, I think particularly with the euro, I mean, people were not really in favour of the euro because people have seen that kind of collapse now, this sense that we were all Europeans. people, I think, have definitely shifted back. No, we quite like being British now, actually. And in being British, we can also explore our kind of ethnic grouping. So I think we've shifted to this sense of you don't have to have one or the other. You can have both.
Well, you're nodding away there.
Yeah, like nodding like crazy. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, especially now in a globalised world where people move around much more, where work is much more flexible and people have to adapt more quickly to new situations, new identities. It's very important that a range of identities that people can feel comfortable with are made available for all sorts of people. And I think it's a very important point that you made about, you know, that the feeling that you belong institutionally can enable you to lay claim to an identity. And I think this relates back to what we were saying about the faith schools, which is that it's my research has shown that pupils in faith schools, Muslims in particular, feel absolutely no less sense of belonging in Britain, actually slightly more than kids that are in non-denominational state schools. And this, I think, is precisely because there's a place for them where their faith can belong, and so it's much easier to associate with a wider society than if you're constantly having to struggle for your identity in a more difficult circumstance.